How much does the Delta variant pose as a threat to highly vaccinated areas like the DMV? Let's bring in once again tonight Dr. Amesh Adalja, who's senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, to help us break this all down. So, Doctor, we know that the Delta variant is more contagious than the other strain that we've seen. We also know that vaccinated people are testing positive. So I think that we're all wondering, how much of a risk does the variant pose to people here in the U.S. who are vaccinated?
So if you're somebody that's fully vaccinated, that means 2 weeks after your second dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, or 2 weeks after the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it doesn't appear that the Delta variant poses much of a risk to you. What we're seeing in Israel is kind of a phenomenon of what they're doing there. So some of those people were not fully vaccinated. So they were vaccinated, they may have received one vaccine dose, or they may not have waited the 2 weeks after their second dose, and they might have contracted it. And what's happening in Israel is that they are testing a lot of people with asymptomatically, people without symptoms, which we don't really necessarily want to do because those aren't clinically relevant infections. So when you're talking about, can the Delta variant make somebody who's fully vaccinated sick, it's unlikely to be the case. And I think that's what we have to remember, that we're not so much worried about cases here in the United States, but worried about hospitalizations and hospital capacity, because we're not trying to get to COVID-0. And I think the best defense against the Delta variant is to get fully vaccinated.
Right. So those people aren't getting sick. Is it possible at all that they would be able to be asymptomatic and transmit the Delta variant maybe to somebody who isn't vaccinated?
It's unlikely that someone who's fully vaccinated can actually be a focus of spread for this virus. And we've seen that with many other versions of this virus, many other variants, and I think it will hold with the Delta variant. Of course, we want more data on the Delta variant and to see it, understand its epidemiology, but I don't suspect a fully vaccinated individual really would pose a risk to someone who's not vaccinated, even in the face of the Delta variant.
Gotcha. Now that cities are just opening back up, is there the possibility that we would have to roll back any of those loosening of restrictions because of the Delta variant? Any evidence it could get worse in the U.S. In the fall and winter?
I don't think you're going to see kind of forceful restrictions. You might see voluntary restrictions that get put in place, or recommendations, especially in counties, for example, in Mississippi and Alabama, where there's not enough people vaccinated. However, I think it's going to be very different when we see these surges or these increases in cases of the Delta variant, because so many high-risk individuals have been vaccinated, meaning people above the age of 65, where nationally about 77% have been vaccinated. But even in those counties in Mississippi and Alabama where it's low, in that high-risk group, the vaccination rates are high. So we may see cases, we may see upticks in hospitalizations like we're seeing right now in Mesa, Colorado. But I don't think you're going to see this be anything like what we saw, for example, in the spring of 2020 or the winter of 2020, 2021, because so many high-risk people have been vaccinated. There's more population immunity from natural infection. But it's something that can be completely preventable, though. So just because hospitals aren't going into crisis doesn't mean we don't take the Delta variant seriously. So this is something that's completely preventable. Just get vaccinated, and this becomes really a non-issue for the U.S.
And I suppose this entire conversation is really predicated on one thing, and that is, how long will the antibodies for COVID remain in our system after the vaccination? You know, it's almost like there's a race now, perhaps, between the Delta variant and any possibility of having to get a COVID-19 booster shot. Do you see that playing out?
Well, we know so far that these vaccines have produced durable immunity. They've looked in the bone marrow of people that have been vaccinated. They have cells there that are producing antibodies. And the other thing to remember is it's not just antibodies that are induced after a vaccine. There's a whole other arm of your immune system called T cells. And those are really important, especially when it comes to preventing what matters: serious disease, hospitalization, and death. So I suspect that we will have durable immunity from these vaccines that probably last 2 to 3 years. We're going to do the studies to find that out. It may be a little bit different in immunocompromised patients. For example, people who've gotten a solid organ transplant, like a liver transplant or a heart transplant, they may need more frequent boosters. But for the general population, I don't think that there's going to be a need for boosters in the near term.
All right, Dr. Amesh Adalja, all this information, I'm sure, helping a lot of us feel better as we hear more about the Delta variant. Thanks again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.